Snow moved like ash across the wasteland, a silent, endless gray swallowing the horizon. It was 1943, somewhere between nowhere and the front. The war had carved another wound into the map, a new prisoner camp, rows of wooden barracks behind fences that glittered with frost and barbed wire. Men shuffled inside them like shadows, stripped of names, uniforms, and certainty. Only numbers remained, painted on planks, sewn onto rags, scratched into the memory of the living. The cold was not just temperature, it was a condition of existence. Every breath turned white, every step sank into mud stiffened by ice. The guards, wrapped in thick coats and authority, patrolled the perimeter in pairs. Their boots made a rhythm, crunch, pause, turn, like the metronome of captivity. Faces hidden behind scarves and steel helmets, they were more silhouettes than men, part of the machinery that kept the cage intact. At night, the floodlights hummed like tired eyes that refused to blink. The prisoners huddled together, silent, their bodies pressed for warmth, but their minds elsewhere, in kitchens, in gardens, in the faces of children they would not see grow up. When the wind rose, the wire sang faintly, a metallic whisper that never stopped. It was as if the camp itself was alive, breathing despair through its steel ribs. Yet within that stillness, something else stirred, something smaller, quieter. It began as a murmur when rations were passed, or when a man offered half a crust to another too weak to stand. It was a kind of defiance that required no weapon, the act of remembering one's humanity. A British corporal once told a French pilot, "If you forget your prayers, remember them here." The word spread like contraband, a secret currency. Beneath blankets, men mumbled blessings before sleep, tracing invisible crosses on their chests. To the guards, it was nonsense, primitive superstition. But to the prisoners, it was proof that they still belonged to something higher than orders or war. The barbed wire meant to divide began to take on another meaning. It was cruel, yes, sharp, cold, absolute, but it framed their only view of the sky. When the sun broke briefly through the clouds, its light snagged on the metal, turning it silver. Some said it looked like a crown of thorns. Others said it looked like hope caught mid-flight. Every camp has its own sound. Some echo with commands, others with coughing. This one carried the faint murmur of faith, battered, half frozen, but alive. It was not loud enough to challenge authority, not strong enough to melt ice or loosen chains, but it endured. The war had given them nothing to believe in, yet somehow a leaf persisted, not in victory, not in nations, but in endurance itself. Between the wire and the wind, in a place built to erase the soul, the first spark of something sacred began to flicker. Metal built to cage, and faith built to endure. Morning came without warmth. The sun rose behind a curtain of mist, pale and indifferent. The camp stirred, boots scraping the ground, tin cups rattling against frozen wood, the cough of men who hadn't known comfort in months. The guards shouted in short, clipped words, but the prisoners moved without resistance. Hunger had long since taught them obedience. Inside the barracks, life had become a negotiation between pain and purpose. They traded in crumbs, buttons, and memories. A spoon could be worth a night's peace. A story could buy a little silence from despair. The older men shared tales of wives and children, of the sound of church bells, of bread that didn't taste of rust. The younger ones listened, half believing, half afraid that hope was just another kind of hunger.
Among them walked a man who seemed untouched by the bitterness that surrounded him. His name was Father Moreau, a thin, aging chaplain with eyes that had seen too much loss and still found something to forgive. His uniform was gone, his collar torn away, but his voice carried the same weight it once did in stone churches. He moved quietly, never drawing attention, whispering prayers as if speaking to a God who needed reminding that this place existed. He held small gatherings at night, never more than 5 or 6 men, always in a corner shadowed from the guard's view. No sermons, no preaching, just a few words about endurance and the old rhythm of familiar prayers. For a few minutes they felt human again. They were not prisoners then, but a congregation of survivors, bound not by barbed wire, but by belief that the soul could not be captured. To the guards it was foolishness, men talking to an invisible friend while the world burned. They allowed it because it seemed harmless, even pitiful. But what they couldn't see was that the chaplain's words rebuilt something inside those men, something the war had tried to strip away. At roll call, when the guards counted heads like numbers on a ledger, Father Moreau would whisper, "We are still here." It wasn't defiance shouted into the wind, but a quiet oath. They can take the body, not the spirit. Even as disease crept through the camp and frost claimed the weakest, the prayers continued. Sometimes a man would die in the night, his last sound a whisper of faith. By morning, another would take his place in the circle. The rhythm never broke. Each whispered prayer, each song hummed under breath, each crumb shared, these became small acts of rebellion. No flag, no rifle, no speech could match them. Their bodies bent under cold and hunger, but their souls stood straight. In a place built to erase identity, they remembered who they were: fathers, brothers, sons, believers. The war could starve them, beat them, bury them beneath snow and shame, but it could not make them forget the most dangerous truth of all. They were still men. The winter deepened, and with it came a new face of authority. The old commandant was gone, transferred, executed, forgotten. In his place arrived Captain Reinhardt, a man whose uniform seemed stitched from the very idea of order. His boots shone even in mud. His gaze, sharp and cold, moved like a blade across the assembled prisoners. His first day was marked by silence. He inspected the barracks, the fences, the rations, the guards, each detail weighed, measured, and filed away. When he finally spoke, it was not with cruelty, but calculation. No gatherings, no assemblies. You pray, you plot. You sing, you signal. You will work, eat, and sleep. Nothing more. His tone carried no anger. It didn't need any. His words were iron. Father Moreau's quiet gatherings ended overnight. The men obeyed, because in camps like this, disobedience didn't echo. It disappeared. Yet silence carries its own defiance. When the guards passed, they saw lips moving, but heard no sound. When they searched the barracks, they found no crosses, no books, only the look of men who had learned to hide their faith beneath their breath. Reinhardt understood discipline, not devotion. He saw prayer as weakness, belief as infection. But even he could not control what men dreamed about. He ordered new labor, scrap collection. The prisoners were to clear the camp's junkyard, a graveyard of twisted metal, shell casings, and burnt machinery. Rusted fragments of war, bent by fire and explosion, were piled like bones beneath the snow. Day after day they hauled the debris, weapons that would never fire again, helmets that had once held heads, steel that had known purpose only in destruction. Each clang of metal echoed like a memory of violence. But among the prisoners, something began to shift. In their hands, the weight of the metal felt different. It was no longer a symbol of war, but raw material, cold, useless, yet full of possibility. One British sergeant whispered, "Strange, isn't it? The same iron that kills could build something beautiful." No one answered, but the thought lingered like smoke. Reinhardt, efficient and emotionless, never saw the spark beneath the surface. He believed control was complete, that the prisoners were too weak, too broken to dream. But within their silence, imagination began to stir. At night, when the wind howled through holes in the barracks, the men listened to it whistle through pieces of scrap left outside. The sound was eerie.
The wind that night sounded like breath drawn through broken glass. It slipped through cracks in the barracks, over rows of sleeping men, and across a camp buried in silence. But one man stayed awake, Sergeant Thomas Hale, a mechanic before he became a prisoner. His hands, once meant for engines, now trembled from cold and hunger. Yet they still remembered creation. He sat by the dying glow of a tin lamp, turning over a shard of steel he'd hidden from the scrapyard. It was jagged, blackened by fire. His fingers traced its edges as though reading a scripture written in ruin. For hours he scraped and bent the metal with a small rock, his breath fogging in the air. Slowly, the shape emerged, uneven, imperfect, but unmistakable. A cross. When morning came, a Frenchman spotted it glinting beneath Hale's blanket. He said nothing at first. Then, with a voice hoarse from disbelief, he whispered, "You're mad." Hale smiled faintly. "Maybe, but I'm tired of building graves." The word spread, quiet, contagious. By nightfall, 5 men had joined him near the fence line, pretending to sort debris for repair work. They searched for metal pieces that could bend, rods that could frame something bigger. The idea was madness, and they all knew it. But in a place ruled by hopelessness, madness sometimes felt like faith in disguise. They dreamed aloud in fragments. "A chapel," said one. "Something small," said another. "Something that doesn't rot," whispered Hale. They would build it from what the war left behind: bomb casings, ration tins, wire, bolts. Every piece of ruin would have its place. When the guards noticed them collecting scraps with uncharacteristic energy, they laughed. "What are you building, a tank?" one jeered. Hale only looked up, eyes steady. "Something you wouldn't understand." The guards smirked, tossed him another rusted plate, and walked away. By some miracle, the work was allowed to continue. Perhaps the officers thought it a harmless distraction, a way to keep the men docile. Perhaps curiosity outweighed suspicion. Whatever the reason, permission or indifference became a doorway. At dusk, the prisoners began to gather quietly near the junkyard, the sky fading to violet. They worked without plans, without blueprints, guided by memory and longing. Each clang of metal was an act of defiance against despair. The smell of rust filled the air, and when sparks flew from flint against steel, it seemed as though stars were being born from the ashes. One man murmured, "God builds with broken things." By the time night swallowed the camp again, the first rough pieces of their chapel lay in the snow, crude, uneven, fragile. To anyone else, it looked like scrap arranged by fools, but to those who had seen nothing but destruction, it was the first sign that creation was still possible. The spark had come, small, flickering, and holy. The snow returned with a quiet vengeance. It drifted over the camp, softening the ugliness of wire and watchtowers, as though the sky itself wanted to forget what stood below. Beneath that pale hush, the prisoners worked. Their breath hung like smoke, their fingers cracked and raw. Every movement was slow, deliberate, born not from strength, but from faith that refused to surrender. They shaped the wreckage of war into something sacred. Steel plates once torn from trucks became walls. Bent tin sheets were hammered flat and nailed into a roof that sang in the wind. From barbed wire they twisted a rough circle, a window frame shaped like a crown. "Christ wore worse," someone said quietly, and no one laughed. The work gave rhythm to their days. Mornings began with scraping frost from tools, afternoons with the music of hammer and rust. Each clang echoed across the camp,
sharp but strangely hopeful, like the heartbeat of a body too stubborn to die. The men no longer shuffled like ghosts. They moved with purpose. Even those too weak to lift metal offered what they could: a nail, a whispered prayer, a place to stand guard while others built. Father Moreau walked among them, his coat little more than rags now, his eyes burning with quiet pride. "Every wall you raise," he told them, "is a prayer without words." They did not answer, but their hands moved faster. The guards watched from a distance. At first they mocked it, a church made from junk. But curiosity crept in like thaw through ice. A few began to linger, pretending to inspect, sometimes dropping a handful of nails or a strip of wire before turning away too quickly. They said nothing. The prisoners said less. Yet in those silent exchanges, something unspoken passed between captor and captive. Not friendship, but recognition. The camp, for the first time, began to sound alive. The pounding of hammers replaced the barking of orders. The smell of oil and cold iron filled the air, mingling with breath and snow. Their chapel grew like a secret confession, small, imperfect, yet undeniably human. At dusk, when light faded and work ended, the men would stand before the half-built structure in silence. No prayers were said. They didn't need any. The church itself was the prayer, built not by the free, but by the faithful. Their hands bled into the snow, red fading into white. The wind tugged at their rags. The guards' voices drifted across the yard, and still they stayed, hands on metal, eyes lifted towards something unseen. What had begun as labor had become liturgy. Each nail, each bruise, each drop of blood was an offering, and as night fell over the camp, the chapel stood half-born, trembling in the cold, a monument to men who had nothing, yet gave everything. The chapel stood half-finished, ribs of metal reaching into the sky like frozen prayers. The men called it many things: sanctuary, folly, miracle. By day it gleamed faintly beneath the pale sun, and by night it loomed like a ghost, a reminder of both their hope and their hunger. But within its shadow, another battle began, one that could not be measured by bullets or blood. The men had grown weary. Food had grown scarcer, tempers thinner. For some, the chapel no longer symbolized faith, but futility. A young Scotsman spat near its base one evening and muttered, "God forgot us long ago. We're just too stubborn to notice." His words rippled across the group like a stone through still water. No one argued, not at first. They simply went on working, hammers striking steel in rhythm to their silence. That night, Father Moreau gathered a few near the crude altar frame. His voice was low, almost pleading. "Even if he does not hear us," he said, "we must hear each other. That is how faith survives." But doubt had already settled between them. When the storm came, it arrived without warning. Wind howling, snow cutting through the air like shards of glass. The men scrambled for shelter, but the half-built chapel shuddered under the weight. A crossbeam bent, tearing loose from its joint. They could only watch as the structure groaned in pain, like a living thing struggling to stand. The next morning, the storm passed, leaving silence and ruin. The beam hung crooked, barely attached. The men stood before it, defeated. One muttered, "Maybe that's our answer." No one disagreed. That night, when the camp slept, a figure moved quietly through the snow. A guard. His name no one would ever know. He had watched the building rise day by day, seen the prisoners bleed for it, and perhaps something in him had shifted. Maybe he had believed, too. He stepped into the chapel's shell, lantern trembling in his gloved hand. The beam hung loose like a broken arm. He set down his rifle, took up a wench left behind, and began to tighten the bolts. Metal scraped softly against metal. He worked slowly, with care, every motion deliberate, as if afraid of being caught, or of breaking the fragile peace that lived here. When he finished, he touched the beam lightly, then traced the small steel cross Hale had made still resting on the altar. His breath fogged the air. For a moment he stood still, neither guard nor enemy, just a man inside a sacred silence. Then he left, leaving no sign but the beam, straightened and secure. By morning, no one knew who had done it. Some said it was a miracle, others said nothing. But when the men returned to their work, their hands moved with quiet purpose again. The war outside raged on. Inside the camp, faith fought its own. Spring came reluctantly, crawling over the ruins of winter. The snow thinned, revealing the ground beneath. black earth, frozen mud, and the scattered gleam of iron. The chapel stood at last, finished in silence, every inch a testament to the hands that refused to stop.
It was ugly and beautiful all at once. The walls leaned, uneven but sturdy. The steeple, if one could call it that, was forged from bomb casings welded together in jagged symmetry, their hollow mouths now pointing toward heaven instead of war. Tin sheets clattered softly in the wind like rusted bells. The altar was a ration crate draped in a torn blanket, and when light passed through the one cracked window pane, its fractured glass scattered colors across the metal walls, a poor man's stained glass, born from ruin. No one spoke as they stood before it. The men who had built it, soldiers, farmers, prisoners, simply looked, unsure whether to laugh or weep. In its imperfection, it mirrored them, battered, bent, still standing. Father Moreau approached the doorway and removed his cap. His hair was white now, his hands shaking from cold or exhaustion, no one could tell. "We have built it," he whispered, "from the bones of war." When the commandant arrived, the camp froze. Captain Reinhardt's presence still carried the weight of iron. 2 guards followed, boots slicing through the mud. He stopped before the chapel, eyes scanning its crude angles. The air was so still the prisoners could hear his coat creak as he crossed his arms. "What is this?" he asked, though he already knew. No one answered. Hale stood near the front, dirt on his face, steel filings on his sleeves. Reinhardt stepped forward, hand trailing over the cold metal wall. "You built this, with scrap." "Yes," said Father Moreau quietly, "from what was left." The captain paused, his reflection fractured in the steel. His expression didn't change, but something in his eyes softened, just slightly, like thaw beneath frost. After a long silence, he said only, "You may pray." It wasn't permission spoken as a command, it was surrender, small and wordless, to something he couldn't control. The men bowed their heads. No hymns, no ceremony, only the sound of breathing, of wind brushing the metal walls. For the first time, the guards did not interrupt. Even Reinhardt stood still, his shadow falling inside the chapel like a reluctant benediction. The building trembled in the breeze, fragile and alive. The barbed wire beyond it glimmered in the sunlight, once a boundary, now a frame for something greater. It was not a church built for God's eyes, but for man's need to remember that he still had a soul. And so, beneath a sky still gray with war, faith found a home made from the wreckage of its enemies. For the first time, the camp was silent, not with fear, but with reverence. It was Christmas Eve, though the date meant little in a place where time had lost its shape. Snow drifted in lazy spirals, settling over the barbed wire, softening its cruel edges. Inside the camp, men moved quietly toward the chapel, breath fogging in the cold. Their boots left shallow prints in the snow, a slow procession of the condemned, walking toward something that wasn't rations or roll call, but remembrance. Inside, the air was brittle, heavy with the smell of iron and frost. Candles, scavenged stubs melted into ration tins, flickered along the walls. The chapel's steel ribs groaned softly in the wind. Every sound seemed sacred in that moment. A cough, a shiver, the scrape of metal benches shifting closer together. Father Moreau stood at the front, the altar a rough wooden crate. His fingers trembled as he adjusted the small tin cross they'd made from a broken hinge. When he spoke, his voice was barely more than a whisper. "We have no bread, no wine, no robes, only faith." He looked across faces hollowed by hunger and hardship, eyes sunken yet bright. Some were too weak to stand, others knelt, hands clasped, not in ritual, but in survival. Behind them, the guards lingered at the door, rifles lowered but not forgotten. The first prayer rose like breath against the cold. Latin murmurs echoed against steel, foreign yet familiar.
The men sang, if it could be called that, their voices cracking, uneven, but together. Then a sound no one expected, boots crunching on frost. A guard stepped forward, one of the younger ones. He hesitated, then removed his cap. Another followed, then another. Soon 6 stood just inside the doorway, the light of the candles trembling across their faces. No one moved. The rifles hung loose at their sides, not as weapons now, but as burdens. Father Moreau's voice wavered but did not break. "Tonight," he said softly, "we remember not nations, but men." The words hung in the air, melting the distance between them. For a moment, no one was prisoner or guard, victor or captive, only souls caught in the same storm. A hymn began, Silent Night, whispered first by one man, then another, until it filled the chapel in fragile harmony. The guards did not stop it. Some even joined, their accents twisting the melody but never breaking it. The sound carried through the broken window, into the night beyond the wire, rising like smoke into the snow-filled sky. When it ended, no one applauded. They simply stood there, tears freezing on faces that hadn't smiled in months. Outside, the wind passed gently over the camp, as if listening. And in that stillness, something shifted, not in orders or politics, but in hearts. The war still raged beyond the fences, but here, in a church made from scrap and faith, enemies had prayed under the same roof. For one night, peace was real. The war came closer, not as a sound of triumph, but of unraveling. The horizon throbbed with distant thunder, artillery rolling through the last shreds of winter. Rumors spread faster than orders. The front was collapsing, the Reich retreating. Even the guards walked differently now, their boots slower, their eyes elsewhere. The power they once carried had begun to fade like breath on glass. Inside the camp, silence carried a new weight. The men no longer whispered of escape, they whispered of endings. Food had stopped arriving days ago. What little remained was divided without argument, a crust here, a spoon of soup there. And then something unthinkable happened. The guards began to share. A loaf of bread passed through the wire, a tin of meat slid across a table. No speeches, no orders, only hands meeting where hatred once stood. Father Moreau watched it all from the chapel doorway, his fingers still stained with oil and rust. The church, our church, stood quiet against the snow, crooked and perfect. The wind pressed through the cracks in its walls, making the metal hum like a distant organ. That night, as soldiers packed to leave, the commandant came. His coat hung loose, his medals caught no light. He looked at the chapel for a long time, saying nothing. Then he turned to Moreau. "You built this with nothing. Strange how much something can mean when everything else is gone." From his pocket, he drew a small dog tag, the chain broken. He placed it in the priest's hand. "For the next Mass," he murmured, words soft enough to be mistaken for an apology. Moreau nodded, his throat too tight for speech. The metal was warm from the man's touch. At dawn, the gates opened, not for freedom, but for departure. The guards filed out first, their once commanding march reduced to weary steps. Some turned back to look at the camp, at the men they had ruled and punished, and somehow come to understand. The prisoners watched them go without hatred, just quiet recognition, that strange kinship born from shared suffering. Snow began to fall again, erasing footprints before they reached the road.
By afternoon, the camp was nearly silent. The chapel stood alone, its steeple leaning slightly, its cross dark with frost. Inside, a candle still flickered, the last they had left. Father Moreau knelt at the altar. Around him, emptiness echoed like a prayer unfinished. He placed the dog tag beside the tin cross, and for a long time he simply stared at it, one piece of war left behind, now resting in a place meant for peace.
Outside, the wind moved gently through the rusted walls, whispering over the wire that once divided men. It carried no language, no sides, only memory. And somewhere in that sound, faint but real, lingered the echo of forgiveness. Years passed. The war that had swallowed whole nations receded into textbooks and photographs, but time did not erase its whispers. On a quiet hillside in Eastern Europe, long after the last sentry post had fallen to moss, a group of villagers stumbled upon something strange. Half buried beneath grass and snow, a crooked frame of rusted metal jutted from the earth. It looked like nothing at first, the skeleton of a shed, perhaps, but as they brushed away the frost, shapes began to emerge. Curved beams, a roofline, a cross barely standing, its surface eaten by years but still upright. Someone said softly, "It was a church." The air hung still. No one spoke for a long while. The discovery felt less archaeological than spiritual, as if they had disturbed a sleeping prayer. Records later revealed what it had been, a chapel built by prisoners from the wreckage of war, a place born not of victory but of survival, of men who had nothing left to give except faith, hope, and each other. The villagers decided to preserve it, though there was little to preserve. Only fragments remained. A bent altar made from a ration crate, a few twisted bars of wire shaped like a crown, and one corroded dog tag left near the threshold. Its inscription had faded, but the weight of its meaning had not. They fenced the ruins off, not to keep people out, but to keep silence in. Years later, historians photographed the remains. One image, snow gathering in the hollow of the rusted cross, became famous. It appeared in documentaries, textbooks, and museums, but what it stirred could never be fully written down. They built it to remember heaven in hell, the narrator whispers, and they prayed not for victory, but for peace. Images fade in, soldiers in tattered coats, prisoners with hollow eyes, a guard offering bread across a line of wire. Then the chapel again, in snow, in silence, in memory. Rust replaces the shine of steel, but reverence replaces fear. The wire that once divided men now frames a monument that unites them. As the screen fades, the wind returns, that same wind that once moved through the barbed fences, now carrying only echoes. No voices remain, yet everything speaks. The metal hums faintly in the cold, the ground remembers the footsteps, and the air, somehow, feels forgiven. The final image lingers, the cross, leaning, fragile, still defying collapse. Behind it, morning light breaks through the clouds, soft and colorless, but enough. Because in the end, the war took nations, but not mercy, and even rust, left long enough, becomes sacred.